Hello there and welcome to Explain Apologetics. Glad you can join us yet again. We've been having a series of interesting discussions over the last week or so. And today we have a special guest with us. We have Eric Hernandez with us. And before I introduce Eric to us, I'll just give a brief description about him. He's a student. He has graduated from, studied theology in Biola University, and he's also currently pursuing his further studies in Dallas Baptist Universities. Eric is an accomplished debater and has debated many prominent atheists, not least among which is the famous Matt Dillahunty, among a whole list of many others. And I'll just get straight to him and just say, really glad you could be joining us today, Eric.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to be on.
I saw your debate with Matt Dillahunty on the existence of the soul. Why is it that we don't find a lot of discussion about the soul in Christian circles, particularly in the area of theology and apologetics?
I think apologetics in general is still gaining a lot of traction. Definitely isn't where it needs to be, but it's definitely gaining traction. And first and foremost, it's good to just find people talking about apologetics in the first place. So I'd say that the first issue is just getting apologetics into the churches and into the minds of believers overall. And then you find that the ones who are familiar with the basics of apologetics, usually they're and there's nothing wrong with this. Let me preface by saying that they're usually more familiar with someone like Little Man Craig's work. So you'll hear a lot of Kalam, which is great. I mean, it's a fantastic argument that I still use in debates when I can and whatnot. But I think the issue with the soul is kind of the same thing, and the same reason why apologetics isn't as popular as it should be. And it's because I think a lot of people take these things for granted. So belief in God was something that a lot of people took for granted so many years ago, where maybe 30 to 50 years ago, you didn't really have to ask someone if they believed in God. Your average person on the street did. So it's just kind of something that was taken for granted. And when you take these beliefs for granted and you're not taught to think rationally, then you're not going to think why it is you believe what you do, or you're not going to think how you can demonstrate your beliefs to be true. So I think that's the first issue. So in that same principle, even though there are people who are beginning to now study apologetics, I think the same thing applies with respect to the existence of the soul. I think in the same sense, people just kind of take that thing for granted. They just, it's so ingrained into their beliefs. I think they've either never challenged it, or they've heard a, I don't want to put this in any kind of rude or disrespectful way, but they've heard a general maybe definition from a minister, preacher, pastor that just kind of said, yeah, that sounds about right. I think that's what the soul is. And any talk about the soul revolves merely around the mind. There's nothing else being talked about or what it is. So I think it's kind of one of those things that we just take for granted and we don't think about until we're challenged. And I'll even say I was guilty of that, so many years ago when I first, this is actually the thing that got me into apologetics. So I come at it from a different perspective, but yeah, I think it's just one of those things that people take for granted.
Well, thanks for that insight. Yeah, certainly it's one of those issues that we take for granted. By no means the only issue, of course. And I want to maybe just ask your thoughts on this statement by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, I believe, said that, and correct me wrong if it's not C.S. Lewis. He said that you don't have your soul. You don't have a soul. You are a soul. You have a body. Now, what's your thoughts on that statement? And just share with us what are the implications of that statement?
C.S. Lewis may have said it. The person I heard first say that was J.P. Moreland. That's where I learned most of my stuff on the soul, was from Moreland. He's by far my favorite philosopher around today. And I bought a key of soul because of how influential this topic was. And he spoke at one of our conferences, and I actually had him in my key of soul. So I had the man who is an expert on the soul, J.P. Moreland, my favorite guy, in my soul a few months ago, driving him around for our conference. So that was something fantastic.
He did send an email to you, right, about that recently, telling you that he enjoyed that.
Yeah, he did. Every now and then, if I can or something, I'll shoot him an email, or he'll shoot me an email and stuff like that. Of course, he's a busy guy and whatnot, but yeah, it's great to have even just a modicum, any amount of time with him is fantastic. But yeah, so I'm not sure if it was C.S. Lewis, like I said, that said that originally, but I mean, it's definitely, I agree, of course. So I hold what's called substance dualism, and it is the view, as you articulated, it's So there are two types of substances we're looking at or talking about when we're talking about human beings, something physical and then something immaterial. And when I say that I am a soul, it means that the position of substance dualism is that at my core essence, what is essential to me is that I am immaterial. So I am a soul that has a body. So to put it technically, I don't have a soul. I am a soul and I have a body. So I have a body, but I am a soul. You can't really say I have a soul. It's that I am a soul and I have a body, and a body without a soul is just a corpse.
Right, right. So, I mean, that makes so much sense, right? Because, the whole idea is that, when a person dies, and you see in the Bible, for example, I think it was Luke 16, you have this conversation between Abraham and the rich man and Noah. And some people say, well, that's a parable. Nowhere in the text is that described as a parable. But what we do see is that even though Abraham's body is here, Abraham is still Abraham. So the body is not what makes Abraham Abraham. It's the soul, and that kind of fits into what you say, what you just said, right?
Yeah. I'd say it definitely fits. Even when Christ is talking with the Sadducees, he kind of says something similar. He says because they didn't believe in an afterlife, or soul, if any of that type. And basically, he uses one of their favorite verses and said that God is a God of the living. And then he says, quoting one of their favorite verses, that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that if He's the God of these people, and these people no longer are here on earth in a physical body, and yet He's a God of the living, and He's our God, then He must be the God of them, and they must still exist, even though they are without a body. So, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, fantastic stuff. Okay, now I've also heard Christians actually challenge that by saying that, well, if that's the case, then you basically, that's Gnosticism, this idea of dualism, and that you have this soul and that this temporal body it's just temporal. That's Gnosticism. And why are you bringing Gnosticism back into Christianity again? It's an early heresy. How would you respond to
I would say, I know you are, but what am I? No. um,
that?
No, it's kind of one of those things where they're trying to pin a guilt by association. Now the Gnostics believed that anything material was evil, and it was for this reason, in fact, that they didn't think that Christ had a body; they think He was just a spirit. And this is why Paul says that Christ did come in body, and that He did, and Scripture teaches us that He did rise physically from the dead. And then it goes as far as to say, and if anyone tells you otherwise, then they're preaching a different gospel. So this was in response to the Gnostics. Now, again, this was because of their underlying presupposition that the body was evil. So for them, the reason they think Christ didn't have a body was because if He was perfect, then He could have had a body because the body was evil. Now, that's where the accusation of Gnosticism comes in, because it's as if they try to say, well, if you're going to separate these two things, something physical and something immaterial, then you're leaning into the area of Gnosticism. And I think, no, of course not. That's ridiculous. It's like saying, if I pray 3 times a day, I'm a Muslim, because Muslims pray 3 times a day. So it's this kind of guilt by association thing. So substance dualism doesn't have any inherent implications towards anything like that. Now, I'm not saying someone can't maybe hold to something like that, but substance dualism is simply saying that there is something different between me, the self. So when I use the word I, that word I is an indexical word that points to something. So like when I say here or there or that, it's a word I'm using to refer to something. When I use the word I'm referring to me, the subject, the self. So when I use the word I, am I talking about a body, or am I talking about something more than a body? So substance dualism is simply pointing to the fact that when I use the word I'm not talking about a body. Because, for example, if I said, point to me, and I just kind of let you point, what part of my body are you going to point to? Because, and here's is where we get into arguments for the soul and substance dualism. When we say, okay, if I am just a body, then certain implications would follow. So we can pin it by saying I am either a purely physical object or I'm an immaterial substance, something like a soul. So let's say if we say, okay, well, if I cut off my arms and legs, am I still Eric Hernandez? If you say yes, then we can at least check off the list. Okay, then perhaps arms and legs are not necessary or essential to being Eric Hernandez. And then you keep going down the list. Now, what I think this is starting to show is that I am not the same thing as my body if I can still be myself without certain parts of my body. So there must be something more to me than merely a body. And we can go deeper there, but tell me if you want me to slow down or expand on something else.
No, this is fantastic. I mean, this is absolutely fantastic. And I hope those of you who are watching this, you've not been exposed to, if you've not already been exposed to the idea of a soul, I certainly hope that, that this is something that causes you to work more in this area. We do want to, of course, first begin by just touching the biblical aspect. And I did want to address some of the issues that came up, particularly with your recent debate with Skylar Fiction as well. That's a must-see, and I will definitely put this in the description box. If you want to see, Eric Hernandez's debate with Skylar Fiction on modern day debate, you really need to check that out to see how he employed this in that debate. So, but before that, I did want to talk about, because many people now, Christians, hearing you for the first time, they're probably a bit confused at this point. What is Eric saying here? Because you are saying we have a soul and we have a body, but doesn't the Bible say we have a spirit, soul, and body? Share with us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So we haven't got into the arguments yet on the soul. I've touched on them, but we can definitely go there later if you'd like. Because like you were saying, we're just kind of introducing it, because there's a lot we can go into, but it really becomes overwhelming. But it's great stuff to learn and study. In fact, there's a book, and I'm looking for it. It might be downstairs, called Body and Soul by J.P. Moreland. It's a fantastic book. Body and Soul. The subtitle is Human Nature and the Crisis of Ethics, I think. Anyways, so, and that goes into it deeply. So now the question of what you're asking, doesn't the body talk about a spirit as well as a body and a soul? It absolutely does. Now, would this mean, now some people hold to what's called a trichotomous view or a tripartite view of human persons. I hold to a dualist view. So dual means two, a dualist view of human persons. Now, what do we do though when the Bible talks about a body, soul, and spirit? Shouldn't that mean that we should be trichotomous or tripartite? I say no, because the body also talks about heart. It also talks about talks about will. Now, typically, the definition I hear of soul is mind, will, and emotions. So so people already who have understood that much have a concept of something being what they would call a soul, that within it encompasses something like a mind, a will, and emotions. So they already have this idea that these three parts, there can be different parts or aspects or faculties of a soul: mind, will, and emotions. Now, with that principle in mind, if you've learned that much from, and that's the popular definition I usually hear. It's not the definition I hold to. We can go into that later. But in principle, if the soul can have different capacities, then for the substance dualist, the spirit is a capacity or faculty of the soul. So when you talk about which one am I, when I use the word I, am I the body or am I the soul? Well, I am the soul, and I use the body like an instrument. Now, if we add a third substance, let's say spirit, then you still have to ask the question, which one am I? Well, I would take, the best way to explain this, I would say, is this. If I ask someone, how many bodies do you have? And they say one. I say, okay. And I say, how many hands do you have? And they say, oh, I have two hands. I say, oh, so you have one body and two hands. So you have three bodies. And they say, no, I have one body, but my hands are just part of that body. I say, okay, in the same sense, in the metaphysical sense, you are a soul, and within your soul, there are different capacities. One of those capacities is spirit. And so we don't need to posit a separate type of substance in order to explain spirit. We're just saying this is a different capacity when it comes to the soul's abilities.
Oh, that's fantastic stuff. Okay, so that explains the body, soul, and spirit that people will typically bring up. And like Eric, of course, I hold to what is called the bipartite view, which is that we are both soul and body, as we mentioned at the start in the definition that I brought up from C.S. Lewis. Now, we do want to go on a little bit deeper, as we mentioned just now, and start talking a little bit about the arguments for the soul. Now, in your debate, Eric, with Matt Dillahunty, you made two assertions at the start, and maybe we could use that and then transition from there to the evidences for the soul. The first point you made, of course, is that consciousness is not physical. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so like you said, whenever I argue for the soul, or I teach a class on the soul, usually at conferences, there are two basic points I want to hit on. The first is that consciousness is not physical, And the second is that I am more than a brain and body. And from these two, we derive that I am a soul. Um, so the first thing to establish and to understand is that consciousness is not physical, which is what you asked. And in my debate with Matt Dillahunty, as you mentioned, that's one of the first points I touch on. Now, to understand any argument for the soul, it's going to be important to understand what's called Leibniz's law of identity, or for short, we just call it the law of identity. Now, to understand this argument, which will help us grasp the rest of the arguments for the soul, I can use an illustration to teach. An illustration to get into this. So, let me first say that the Leibniz's law of identity basically states that if two things in question are the same thing, then whatever's true of one is going to be true of the other. So let's pretend I walk into a lab and I see two bottles of clear fluid sitting on the table. And I ask myself, are these two the same substance? Are they identical? In philosophy, identical literally means the same thing as. So I look at the characteristics, their properties, and I see that both of these bottles have a clear fluid in them. And I say, okay, these whatever the substance is, it has a clear fluid. They both have the property of being a clear fluid. So maybe they are the same substance. Maybe they're identical. But then I see that one says chemical X and one says water. I don't know what chemical X is, but I think maybe it's water. Maybe the label fell off. But then I turn it over and I see it on the back of chemical X. It actually says constant flammable. And I think, okay. Well, even if I don't know what chemical X is, at the very least, I know that it's not the same thing as water, because I know that water does not have the property of being flammable. So using Leibniz's law of identity, automatically we've already seen that these two substances, whatever the other one is, cannot be the same thing because they share different properties. In the same sense, I would say that if naturalism is true, the view that only physical things exist, then when it comes to human beings, you get into what's called a first view of human persons, and that's just that human beings are purely physical parts composed of purely physical substances and purely physical properties, which means that if consciousness exists, it would have to be reduced to something physical like the brain. So we ask the question, is consciousness something physical or non-physical? And whenever I teach this, especially at churches, I like to go in by asking this question. I like to say something like this. What part of your body thinks? And I ask them, point to what part of your body thinks. In fact, if you're watching, point to what part of your body thinks. And then I'm going to go ahead and say, this is actually a trick question. Most people, when I ask them that question, they do this and they say that. Okay, so it's your brain that thinks. Okay. And then I say, all right, now, do you need a brain to think? Most people say yes. And then I say, okay, does God think? And yes, of course he does, right? The Bible says that his thoughts towards us are more than the grains of sand. And then I ask the question, does God have a brain? This is usually where people kind of pause and maybe get a little quiet. Some kind of say yes, some say no. And the answer is no, because we're not Mormons, right? God is not a physical entity. So no, God doesn't have a brain, but he thinks just fine. Huh? How does he do it? And then I ask, hey, wait a minute, aren't you made in his image? And of course, the point here is, we're taught that your brain thinks because, perhaps we don't want school systems or any kind of other secular places. I'm not saying anything against them, but they don't want to bring anything spiritual or supernatural into the mix. And in the name of trying to be neutral, they reduce everything to something physical like the brain. And that's not being neutral. That's actually going to a naturalistic perspective. But we're taught that the brain thinks, and then we go to church and we worship a God who thinks and yet has no brain. And we never let these two beliefs come together. So if consciousness and if physicalism is true, if human beings are nothing but purely physical, then consciousness must be identical to something brain. Now, going back to what I said about Leibniz identity, we can apply it to this question: is consciousness physical? And I think the answer is clearly no. How do we know that? Well, let's look at the properties of the mind and look at the properties of the brain. When you look at a state of the mind like a thought or a belief, we can see that some beliefs can have the property of being true or false. So my thought that I'm talking to you right now, that's either true or false. It's a thought and it's a belief. Now let's look at the brain. Is there any part of my brain that are true or false? Can I point to a set of neurons and say these neurons here are true, but these neurons over here are false? Well, no, that doesn't even make sense. Let's look at another characteristics. My brain can be 3 pounds, but I'm online right now talking to you doesn't weigh 3 pounds. The joke is usually said that, we may be having heavy thoughts if you're listening, but you're not going to go buy a neck brace after this program ends, right? Because your thoughts don't weigh that. My brain can have the property of being 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana, which is in my mind, is not 7 inches long. And we can go through dozens of more examples, but the point is simple. And it's that if all the properties of the brain are physical and all the properties of the mind are non-physical, then it follows that if consciousness exists, it can't be physical. And this is where I usually could use it in an argument and say, so if you're conscious and you now know that consciousness isn't physical, then you shouldn't be a physicalist or a naturalist.
Well, so it's really amazing to know that you can actually tackle atheism then, or actually, to be more specific, not atheism, but you can tackle naturalism, which for those of you who are new to this term watching at home, naturalism is the view that nature is all that exists. And if you believe in that, then obviously you can basically point to the existence of a soul to at least get them to abandon some sort or some form of naturalism. And I like the fact that you pointed out that, you can distinguish that which is natural, the brain, from the thought, and show the distinction of the properties between these two things. Now, maybe could you just share with us a little bit more, Eric, on, for example, why is it that you can test the brains, but you can't test thoughts? You would have to ask someone about their thoughts in order to know that. And how does that work in the argument itself for the soul?
I have actually used this argument against an atheistic position whenever I've argued in debate. So, and here's the reason why, because I would argue that if atheism is true, and the only game in town that we have to explain our existence would be naturalistic evolution, then I would say the most logically consistent position to take, if there is no God, is a form of naturalism. And this would explain how we got here. And I would say that if that's the case, then it would lead to naturalism, and then naturalism, when you look at human beings, and you get physicalism. So I would say if atheism is true, then that would entail some type of naturalism. And if naturalism is true, then you would have to get physicalism when it comes to human beings. However, if consciousness exists and consciousness is not physical, then consciousness would disprove all the rest of them, because you get this epistemic chain. If A leads to B and B leads to C, and then C leads to D, but we know D is not true, then the rest of it, is proven false. Now, the question that you're asking comes from what's known as first-person introspective awareness. And this goes back to Leibniz's law of identity, namely that if there's something true of one thing that's not true of another, then they're not the same thing. So consciousness has this property of being only privately accessible from a first-person perspective. Here's what I mean by that. Let's say you and I were looking at a red ball on a table, and we wanted to know all the details we could figure out. You and I both have equal access to figuring out anything about this red ball. And let's pretend you and I had access to all the technology that we can get our hands on, every microscope, every lab equipment, whatever we needed. You and I could both know about this red ball just the same, right? Or let's say we're looking at an animal in the zoo. You and I could both do any kind of experiments to know about this animal. We can look at the animal's digestive system, without hurting it, of course, for you animal lovers out there, which I am myself. We could sedate it and, look at its muscle structure, look at it, maybe even its brain and all this other stuff. But we can never know what that animal is thinking directly in the same way the animal knows what it's thinking. So to put the point differently, a neuroscientist can know more about my brain than I do, but he can never know more about my thoughts than I do. And that is because consciousness, given that it has an immaterial nature, it is only accessible from a first-person observer. It's privately accessible only to the person thinking it. And the only way we can know what a person is thinking is by asking that person, what are you thinking? Now, someone might think, but wait a minute, Eric, haven't we mapped out parts of the brain to where we know that this part of the brain is associated with memory, and we can actually look at the brain and maybe have an indication or idea, or maybe even in some instances know what a person's thinking. So, for example, we know that when there's C fibers firing, we know that means a person is in pain. But if you're telling me that consciousness is only first person introspective, how does this work? Well, the interesting thing is the only way we know this stuff is because of because of the fact that what I'm saying is true. How so? Well, the way neuroscientists get this information when they try to map out the brain is literally by doing what I said, by asking the person. So let's say they're doing a sleep experiment. If anybody has studied anything like this, they know that whenever a person's sleeping and there's rapid eye movement, we now know that this means that this person is dreaming. They're in a deep REM state. Now, how did we know this? Well, it's not by just looking at the brain and saying, oh, look, they're dreaming. It's because something like this happened, and I'm just kind of oversimplifying it. So they put this person to sleep, and they put these, things on their head, and they're doing these studies and looking at the brain waves. And then they see they see brain waves going off, and they see this person's eyes that are moving, even though they're asleep. And like, what's happening? They're like, I don't know. Wake them up and ask. Hey, John. Hey, what was going on there? Oh, I was dreaming. Oh, great. About what? About puppies and candy canes. Okay, let me write that down. Puppies and candy canes. His eyes were moving. What did his brain look like? Okay, all right. Let's try it again. Put him back to sleep. They put him back to sleep. They let him get into deep sleep. His eyes start moving. There's a certain brain pattern. What's going on? I don't know. Wake him up and ask. They wake him up. Hey, John, what are you doing? Dreaming about what? Puppies and candy canes. Okay. And the more they do this, the more they begin to find out what parts of the brain are associated with what thoughts or what beliefs or what states of the mind. But it was only because we had to ask the person what was going on. In other words, we couldn't just look at the brain and know. We had to ask. Why? Because consciousness has an immaterial nature that is only accessible through that first person perspective. In other words, you and I as a third party observer cannot know about these person's thoughts without asking them. I'll give one more quick example that relates to this. When you go to the eye doctor and they do eye tests, and they say, look at the screen and tell me what you see. Let's say I'm doing an eye test and they say, okay, read these letters off. And I say, okay, it's an A, there's a J, 4, and that's an 8. And let's say the doctor starts laughing and say, you're such an idiot. It's a B, not an 8. Can't you see? And I'll say, well, actually, no, I can't see that. That's why I'm here to do this test. Now, all things being equal, the reason they're doing this is because they can't put themselves in your eyes and your body and see what you're seeing. They have to ask you, how does this appear to you? Why? Because consciousness is a first person introspective kind of thing. So in the same way, this argument lends to the validity and the fact that if consciousness were merely something physical like my brain, then all a person would have to do is look at the brain and they can know exactly what I'm thinking. But if they can't do that, it's because consciousness is not the same thing as the brain. It's kind of something I once heard, a joke of someone, this astronaut said, hey, I went to space and I never saw an angel. And then a neuroscientist said, yeah, well, I've studied the brain and I've never seen a thought.
That is so we realize now, of course, and you kind of touched on this. You kind of touched on this earlier about the evolutionary argument and why is it that they need to. I mean, a naturalist cannot basically account for these things. So how do you then transition from this to talk about God's existence? Is there a way you can do that?
Yeah, there's a number of ways. So, and it just kind of depends on your preference or where the argument's going or what the other person's position is. But basically, if consciousness exists and we have these immaterial things, and we haven't even got to other parts of the soul, but I mean, because again, there's just so much to talk about. But starting with just consciousness is a really good, a great start here. Basically, well, actually, let me touch on that if you don't mind, real quick.
Sure, of course.
Because if we don't have time for that, that's fine. But just to at least introduce it. So, if consciousness exists, and we know that we have these immaterial states and properties of the mind, then they would have to be grounded and possessed by something. So, we know consciousness exists, and we say, okay, well, what possesses consciousness? And then you can say, well, I do. I know that I'm conscious. And okay, then the question is, what am I? That word I, what is it? Is it my body or is it something more than my body? And this is where you can get into the arguments for the soul of things like the indivisibility of personhood or identity through change or freedom of the will. But one thing I already mentioned was the indivisibility of personhood. Basically, if I'm just my body, then chopping my arms and legs off would make me 50% of a person. But if I'm still a 100% person, even though you chop off my arms and legs, then it follows my existence and what I am, my nature, cannot be grounded in my body. Why? Because if you did ground it in my body, then chopping off parts of my body would make me 80% or 20% less of a person. But if it doesn't, then it follows that being a person cannot be grounded to something physical. It must be grounded to something more than the physical, namely the soul. There's a lot more to go into, but that's just kind of just to give you an idea. Now, how can we get to God from this? Well, if things like consciousness exist and the soul would be needed to possess these things, because thoughts do have thinkers, and I am a thinker. And what am I? What's a thinker? It's a immaterial substance. It's a conscious immaterial person. then it would follow that in order to, where do these things come from? Well, if there is no God and all you have is naturalistic evolution, then all you have are physical chunks of matter rearranging themselves into more complicated chunks of matter, kind of like Lego bricks. If you get Lego bricks, you can rearrange them in whatever structure you want. But but let's say you get 1,000 red Lego bricks, excuse me. You get 1,000 red Lego bricks. How many would you have to add or take away, and what structure would you have to give them to get the color blue? Well, that doesn't even make sense, does it? Right? Because the color blue doesn't arise from just rearranging Lego bricks or adding or taking away Lego bricks. In the same sense, if there is no God and all you have is naturalistic evolution, then all you have are particles of matter rearranging with other particles of matter. But how in the world do you get consciousness? And there's a lot more deeper things to say to that. And it's not an argument from ignorance. Let me start by saying that. It's not as if I'm saying we don't know how this happens. We're literally saying it's metaphysically impossible for consciousness to arise by simply rearranging particles of matter, in the same way it's metaphysically impossible to get the color blue by rearranging red Lego bricks. It's just not this. That's not how these things work. So if consciousness exists, then I would argue it must have been the case that there must have been something that has always been conscious from the beginning that is logically and metaphysically necessary in order to give rise and give consciousness to everything else that's conscious. And you can even kind of go into a type of argument from contingency type of thing here in order to explain the existence of consciousness and conscious minds everywhere else.
All right. Now, if you're watching at home and you're still conscious, it's good for you. There's a lot of information being pounded in there. So hang in with us there. You're still here. Hope is just to give you an introduction on the existence of the soul. And this is something that you can pursue on your own if you're interested. And of course, forgive me for re-emphasizing, if you're still conscious, you're still awake, it's good. Now, I want to quickly get back to the arguments for the existence of the soul. What are some of the strongest arguments for the existence of the soul that you haven't quite touched on here? Do you have that? Would you like to go into that a little bit?
There's a lot of them. Well, I wouldn't say a lot of them. All of the ones that I know of, I like. I'll put it that way. But what I'm trying to say is I like them all. I don't know if there's one in particular that's stronger. There are definitely some that are funner to think about. And it, depending on what person you're talking to, I think would depend on which one you're going to use. But there's one, for example, that I think is really fun, and it's the argument from the unified visual field. It's an argument that was developed by philosopher Eric LaRocque, and I can introduce the argument by way of an illustration. Suppose I tear a chapter out of every book and I give it to and I'm in a classroom and I give it to 10 different students, and there's 10 different chapters. Is there anybody in the class that is reading the entire book? No, but someone can step outside the class and maybe say that the whole class is reading the book, perhaps. But technically speaking, there's not one person reading the entire book. For that would take everybody else sharing their chapters with everyone else, right? Now, with this in mind, it's important to understand this. When we look at the brain, we now know through neuroscience that there are certain regions of the brain that are associated with the mind processing different aspects of an object. So when you look at when you look at an object, your brain kind of breaks this up into the object's properties. So one part of the brain is associated with the mind's process, and think of the brain like an instrument. You know, when I play guitar, I don't, but if I were to play guitar, certain strings are associated with playing certain notes and certain keys. If I lose some of the strings, I will not be able to play certain notes or a certain song, because while a string on a guitar is not the note C, it may be associated with playing that particular a note C in a particular octave. That being said, when I look at an object, a certain part of my brain is associated with the object's color. Another part of the brain is associated with the object's shape. Another part of the brain is associated with the object's whether it's in movement or not, and so on and so forth. But we actually now know that there's no part of the brain that kind of puts it back together. What do I mean by that? When I look at an object, like let's say my laptop, I don't just see black. I don't just see square. I see an object that is square, that is black, that has this going on, that is this distance from me, and so forth. Why is that the case? Eric LaRocque says, imagine this, and I kind of paraphrase and modify his illustration in this argument. Let's say you have a recipe for a cake, and you have 10 chefs in 10 separate kitchens, and you give each of these chefs a piece of the recipe. We could say that no one chef is working on the entire cake, because even if all the chefs do their job, you still don't get a cake. In order to get a cake, what you would need is a master chef to gather all the parts and the ingredients that each of these 10 chefs are working on, and then put it together to have one unified cake. In the same sense, given that when the brain looks at an object, it kind of breaks it into different properties. There is no part of the brain that puts these back into one unified picture. So we can put the argument like this: I am either a purely physical object, or I am an immaterial soul. If I am only a purely physical object, then I should not have a unified visual field. The other premise, I do have a unified visual field, therefore I'm not a purely physical object, therefore I am a soul. So the fact that we see things in a unified sense, that we don't see just red or just square, we see an actual unified image, then it goes to show that we are more than something physical, and there must be some type of a master chef, a soul, that takes all these things to put it into one unified visual field, and that would be me, the conscious subject, the self, the soul. So if I do have a unified visual field, I'm not merely a brain and body. I must be a soul.
These are some really great arguments there that we're hearing from Eric. I want to ask you, Eric, what are some of the strongest objections that you find? Now, obviously, you're not going to be pulling one out of the recent debates that you've been doing, because I'm not quite sure there was any, but maybe what are some of the strongest objections that you've encountered so far against the soul, the existence of the soul?
Yeah. I'm not trying to be funny or anything here. I'm not sure if I can think of a strong objection. I can think of challenges, but I consider a challenge different than an objection, because when I think objection, I think something that kind of undercuts the argument. When I think of a challenge, I just think of something like maybe a hard question. So for example, let's say if I said, my wife loves me, and someone says, well, if your wife loved you, then why did you get into an argument? That may be a challenge to whether or not my wife loves me, but it doesn't prove that it's not as if arguments mean that, your wives don't love you. So anybody who's married, I'm sure you can, what I'm talking about. Arguments happen in marriages, right? So it may be a challenge to the idea of what I'm saying, but it's not an objection that undercuts what I'm saying. That being said, I think some of the more interesting ones would maybe be something like the split brain phenomenon, where people who have seizures, when you cut the corpus callosum, I think it's called, which is the thing that connects the two hemispheres of the brain, when you cut it, there are certain phenomenons that kind of happen when you put these people into experiments. They put these certain things on the brain or on the head, and then they do these experiments with these people where they can actually kind of keep the mind from being able to access. In other words, they'll limit the mind's ability to access maybe the other part of the brain, the other hemisphere of the brain, and you get some interesting results happening. But it doesn't disprove anything about the soul. If anything, it just gives some challenges to, well, how do we explain this? So, for example, there's instances where, let's say, someone, the most famous ones that I hear pose as objections are, okay, look, in one instance, you ask a person if they believe in God, and they say no, and then you block this part of the brain, and then you ask the other hemisphere of the brain, do you believe in God? And it says yes. So one's an atheist, one's a theist. When the person dies, either they go to heaven or hell, and everybody starts laughing and ha ha ha, there's no soul. I say, time out. That doesn't prove that does nothing to disprove or undercut any of the other arguments I've given. It doesn't show that consciousness is physical. It doesn't show that the soul does not exist. It doesn't show that consciousness is not first person introspective. Otherwise, they wouldn't have to ask the person. They can just look at the brain and find out, right? So it does nothing at all to undermine the existence of the soul or any of the arguments we've laid out so far. If anything, it just poses an interesting question and challenges the idea of how we understand the soul, but does nothing at all to disprove the soul. Same thing with what's called the interaction problem. How does an immaterial soul interact with the physical body? Well, again, these are just challenges that bring up interesting questions about the soul, but they don't disprove the soul. Now, how do we answer these things? Well, there's a lot of different ways to answer them. And I think a lot of ways are valid, but let me first reiterate again, they do nothing at all to disprove the soul. In the debate I had with Scholar Fiction that you were talking about, and I do recommend people go watch that. I enjoyed that, and I'm going to start working on a review video of that. But I drive my car. And even if I don't know how my car works, it doesn't mean my car doesn't exist. So if someone says, okay, Eric, you claim you have a car. You claim that you drive it to work every day. Well, not since the social distancing thing, and whatnot. But Eric, you drive a car, right? Okay, how does it work? How does a motor do this and this? I might say, I don't know. Okay, therefore your car doesn't exist. Well, no, that's not how it works. That's an epistemic question of how does this happen versus the ontological question of whether or not this exists. So even if I couldn't answer the how, doesn't mean that the thing in question doesn't exist. It just means I don't know. Now, with the split brain thing, if I hit somebody on the head really hard and they forgot something, does it mean they're now a different person? No, of course not. When the split brain's happening, these experiments, first thing that can be said here is that when you do these experiments, there is something about the experiment that's going on that makes these phenomenons occur, if you will. In other words, when they stop the experiments or they pull the things off the person's head, the person's just normal and fine, goes home, A-okay, there's no problems there. So that's the first thing to be said. Second is it could just be that a certain part of the brain and hemisphere is associated with the answers, and then another part of the brain is associated with the questions. So if you limit the interaction, then one part of the brain has the doubts, the other part of the brain has the answers. And if you only allow the person to utilize the instrument of the brain with the doubts, then sure, it might be an atheist. And if you don't allow it to access the answers, then yeah, it's going to remain a skeptic, whatever. But then once you allow the person to have the answers, okay, then they're back to being a theist. It's kind of like if my wife or my daughter or someone tells me, or my boss says, hey, do this, he tells me, hey, I want you to do this today, and tomorrow I forget, does it mean that I'm a different person? No, it just means that I had a lapse in judgment or I forgot something. So these things don't prove that there's two people or you can split a person into two or anything. It just, they're interesting questions that may pose a challenge to a position, but does nothing to disprove the position at all.
Great stuff indeed. Now, we have kind of come to the final question here before we sign off. And maybe I guess we'll just use this to kind of focus on debates in particular, because I do know that some people watching can be very interested to engage in debates. What advice would you give in terms of your debate experience, and how would you say does this we realize how you can use the idea of the soul to talk about the existence of God, but how would you use this to talk about the gospel? Is there any way that it is relevant to the gospel itself? And I mean, I guess you could preach an entire sermon on this topic alone, but do share with us briefly, if you could, how does this relate to the gospel?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say if there's a soul, then we have more credence and evidence to believe there's something like life after death. And if there's life after death, then it shows first and foremost that we're more than something physical. That we're made in the image of something. We have a pattern or a likeness of something. And if we're persons, then I would say then we're made in the image and have the likeness of a person who was there from the beginning. And through him everything else was created. And of course, I'm talking about God here. And if there's life after death, and when you die, there's going to be an eternity that you'll be facing. And what the gospel shows us is that first and foremost, there is a God who created us and that loves us, and that while we could not get and ascend to him, which every religion teaches that in order to get to heaven, in some sense, you're going to have to work for that. You're going to have to do something to ascend to a God type of level of approval. Where you look at Christianity, and it's the only religion that says there's nothing, absolutely nothing you can do to reach or attain or earn your salvation. And this is why, since we couldn't get up to God, God stepped down and came to us. And he came to us, gave his son, and because of that, we can have hope in a salvation and in an afterlife. So when we look at the fact that there is a soul, we know that there is more to us than something physical, and that we're made in something. We're made after the pattern of something. We're made in the image of God, and we have the capacity to rationalize and to reason. And of course, when you read Scripture, it says, "Come, let us reason." So when you share this with someone, 'cause I've talked to people who, let's say, I've and I use this word in a relative sense. I've had atheists tell me, "You've convinced me a soul exists. Can I still remain an atheist?" And I say, well, consistently, no. Because now you know there's something immaterial to you, and you now know that when you die, that might not be the end of you, and you're going to have to do something with this. And of course, again, there's many different ways to hit it. I would just say, obviously, let the Holy Spirit lead you, and it depends on who you're talking to. But basically, I think this really shows that first and foremost, it makes existence of God much more reasonable and rational to accept, and it shows that we're more than something physical, and that when we die physically, that might not be the end of us, and that there is something to be said about what's going to happen when we die. um, Another thing I would say is that if there is no soul, I would argue that Christianity is completely false. I'd say that. And why do I say that? Because Paul said that if there is no resurrection of the dead, then our hope's in vain. We should be felt sorry for. So if there's no resurrection, Christianity can't be true, according to Paul. Well, I would argue if there's no soul, there can be no resurrection. And in the same sense, Christianity can't be true. But if there is a soul, then we can have hope in a resurrection. And if we can have hope in a resurrection and Christianity is true, then I would say the good news is, which is literally what the gospel means, is that Christ sent his son to die for us. And through him, we can have salvation and we can see our maker face to face. And as a bonus, not that this is necessarily the incentive, but as a bonus, I can see my family that have passed away. I can see my grandmother who passed away. I can see other people who I know have passed away in the past, people that I've never met, and so forth. Again, there's lots of ways to hit it, but the existence of the soul opens up so many doors to so many conversations that can be had that revolve around the gospel.
Indeed. And of course, we remember that the greatest command of all is that you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. All right. So, well, this is it for this section that we are covering on the existence of the soul. If you'd like to know more on the existence of the soul, we'll be listing down a number of uh, videos or debates by Eric Hernandez, particularly the one with Skylar Fiction, and also his debate with Matt Delahanty. I'll also put his channel down, which is Eric Hernandez as well, right? That's your channel. We'll have that in the description box, and I'll strongly recommend liking and subscribing to his channel as well if this is interesting to you, because it's a lot of new stuff coming out that you don't quite see out there yet. So just putting it out there. And also, of course, if you haven't quite subscribed to Explain Apologetics, it will be a great thing to do to support our ministry as well. And just one last announcement, that is tomorrow on Sunday, we'll be having the privilege of having a former Christian on Explain Apologetics. This person was a former Christian, has left the faith, and will be sharing his difficulties for believing in Christianity in light of having been in the ministry as a Christian before. So do stay tuned to that. We'll be having that to you as well on Explain Apologetics. And until next time, well, before that, of course, a big thank you to Eric Hernandez for your time that you spent with us. We really, really appreciate that.
Well, hey, thank you for having me on. I greatly appreciate that as well. And of course, love to see, love what you're doing. Love that you're reaching out to these people and just using this as an evangelistic tool. And as you said, anyone who wants to follow what I do, you can type my name in, Eric Hernandez, and find me on YouTube.
Great stuff. Well, thank you again and again. On behalf of Eric and myself, Samuel Nesan, have a fantastic weekend. Bye for now.